The Flood Management Division at MDE is the state NFIP coordinating office. So we are the mapping partner for Maryland, for all the Maryland counties except for PG. These floodplain maps took a lot of money and effort to create, and we need buy-in from all of our state partners and stakeholders with those maps to maintain them. This is our motivation for today's webinar about LOMARs, because the point of LOMARs is to maintain those maps. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to first Matt Smith, who is my colleague here at MDE. He is the CAP coordinator. In that role, he coordinates and keeps in touch with all of the floodplain managers throughout the state who have, and he's going to talk about their role in the LOMAR process. And then we'll turn it over to Ben Kaiser, who from AECOM to speak on this. I'm just going to read Ben's bio real quick. Ben Kaiser is an engineering manager with AECOM and has 20 years of experience related to MT2 reviews, that's LOMARs, and processing, as well as other aspects of FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program. He is a registered professional engineer and certified floodplain manager, and is currently the Zone 2 MT2 lead. Zone 2 includes FEMA regions 4, 6, and 7. And in case anyone didn't know, we are actually in region 3. So you probably won't get Ben if you submit one. But he is a fantastic asset to us. And at this time, I will turn it over to Matt.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here today. So I'm just going to talk real briefly about if you are a floodplain administrator or a floodplain manager, and how CLOMARs, LOMARs, or letter of map changes kind of apply to you, because we get these questions all the time. So Ben's, this might duplicate a little bit what Ben's going to talk about, but you'll see these acronyms. Letter of map change, or a LOMAC, LMOC, covers LOMAs, letter of map amendment, and also LOMARs, letter of map revision, which is what Ben is going to cover. And there's also CLOMAR, you'll hear that term, which is a conditional letter of map revision. Now, as a floodplain manager or a floodplain administrator, if somebody submits an application or a project that is going to, depending on your ordinance and your regulations, are going to affect the spatial extent or the elevation of the 100-year floodplain, then a LOMAR may be required. And the LOMAR consists of an application to FEMA. Ben's going to go over all of this, but basically it is a revision to the flood maps based on the proposed development within the floodplain. Sometimes they're necessary if you have a floodway or not, and you need to prove no effects to the floodway, or if you're building in the fringe and there's fill and the boundaries or the elevation of the floodplain change, then a LOMAR would be required. So certain development projects are more prone to needing LOMARs than others. And when that application comes in, you're going to have to review it, or have somebody in your engineering department review it, make sure that it's accurate. And then there's also, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ben, there's a sign-off portion in the MT2 LOMAR application, where once you review it and determine that the community is okay with that LOMAR, you're going to have to sign that LOMAR application as well. So we at the state, we're here. We'll review LOMAR applications sometimes, but typically it's more of an application from the developer or some community directly with FEMA, but we can help in an advisory capacity. But also reach out to other people in your jurisdiction if they're available for their expertise, if somebody is familiar with H&H analysis. And Ben's going to go over the ins and outs of what's required for the MT2 application. So that's basically your role as the floodplain manager. is to use these for completeness and also be a coordinating person between, say, a developer and FEMA. So does that about cover it, Ben?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
That was good. Okay, so looking at the agenda here, we've covered the first two topics. I'm going to just first talk about some LOMAR basics for those who aren't too familiar with the terminology and the concepts, and some resources that are available from FEMA and others that you can refer to help you understand the requirements and work through the application process. And then going to take a dive into the various requirements for LOMARs, briefly talk about some common issues, and hopefully have some time at the end for some Q&A. All right, so as Matt had mentioned, just kind of building off of that, there's letters of map change, LOMACs, two main types. There's amendments and revisions. LOMARs that we're going to be talking about today are revisions. Amendments are also called MT1s. Revisions are also called MT2s. Those are the names of the different application forms that each process requires. Amendments, or LOMAs, letters of map amendment, are generally for a specific property or structure, or you can also have like multiple lots or structures in one application sometimes. But those are all based on the elevation of that property or structure compared to the effective BFE, if there is an effective BFE. There's no actual opportunity to change or revise the BFEs. The flood insurance rate maps and other data from FEMA does not get updated or revised with an amendment. The result of an amendment is a letter and document from FEMA that says that either the subject of that request application, that building or buildings or properties, either has or has not been removed from the 100-year or the 1% annual chance floodplain, the special flood hazard area. Those are typically a faster process. It's not as data intensive as the LOMAR process, as the MT2 process. Revisions or LOMARs are not based on specific properties or structures. They're for a general area of the floodplain. They're usually for to reflect projects in the floodplain that would impact the hydraulics, would change the BFE and the floodplain boundaries. They typically require an engineering analysis and modeling to support those changes to the maps, and the resultant documentation from FEMA includes updated flood insurance rate maps and other documentation to reflect the new analysis that has been provided. You can go on FEMA's Map Service Center, the link is here, to look at all of the LOMACs that have been issued. You can search by community, or you can search by firm panel to find those LOMACs, or you can search by case number if you have a case number that you're aware of that you're trying to find. And then also on Maryland flood maps shows the location of issued LOMACs as well. And that link is here also. So just, again, brief terminology: amendments, MT1s, LOMAs, those are all interchangeable. LOMA means a letter of map amendment. So one point of potential confusion is there are fill projects that can be processed as MT1s. Those are called LOMAR Fs, but there are also fill projects that can be submitted as a LOMAR, as an MT2. So LOMARs, although there isn't, an F in the title, can be for a fill project. So it just depends on, the where the fill is being placed, how much it is, if it's going to impact the BFE, if it's in the flowway or not, what the local permit requirements are for projects like that. So fill can be both an MT1 or an MT2 depending on the situation. And then we also have conditionals for both, which are for proposed projects. And in some cases, LOMARs are required depending on the project and the impact that it will have. And we'll go over that here in a couple of slides. So now focusing on the LOMARs, the MT2 side of things. What is a LOMAR? Again, as I mentioned, it shows the changes, the revisions to the base flood elevations and the floodplains and the flowways. And so just you can see here on the screen, just a little screenshot of an example. We call it a firm attachment, a flood insurance rate map attachment that is not this, doesn't necessarily show the whole firm panel if it's a relatively small area that's being revised, which is often the case for LOMARs. It just shows the vicinity of the area being updated with a box showing where the data has changed. It revises but does not republish the firm panel. So when you go on FEMA's Map Service Center and you download just that firm panel, if there are any LOMARs on that panel, they won't be shown. I think in the future, FEMA's looking to have them updated live like that with LOMARs, but you have to expand. There's an option to expand that entry on the website and look at any LOMACs that have been issued for that firm panel. And then just different reasons for why somebody would submit a LOMAR. It's often driven by development construction projects in the floodplain, either residential or commercial development. You know, some communities do strictly, do regulate that pretty heavily in Maryland. So that is less common in some communities than others. Bridge projects, bridge culvert replacements, stream restoration projects, things like that. The majority of, I think, LOMARs that get submitted are driven by projects like that, but also sometimes a community may just want to do a new study of the floodplains. Maybe they've got planned development and they want to get a better idea, a more detailed depiction of what the flood hazards are compared to what's currently shown on FEMA's maps. So there can be requests that don't include any projects. And then occasionally if there's an error or something that needs to be updated with the effective data, FEMA will process LOMARs to make those adjustments. As I mentioned, there are conditional LOMARs or CLOMARs. Those are for proposed projects. It does not result in any change to the firm or flood insurance study data at that time. It's what FEMA says is it's their comment on a proposed project and the impacts that it's anticipated to have on the flood hazard data. Typically, they must be followed up by a LOMAR after the project is built, and that's when the maps get updated. And then it's also important to note that from FEMA, FEMA is clear that an approved CLOMAR from FEMA does not equal a permit, that it does not require a community to approve a permit just because a CLOMAR is issued by FEMA. There obviously are a lot of other considerations that need to be factored in to that permitting process. So that's why they say it's a comment from FEMA. So when is a CLOMAR required? There are two scenarios where it is required per the minimum National Flood Insurance Program regulations, and it depends on the basically on whether or not there is a floodway. So if there and if there are BFEs established, so if it's a zone AE floodplain which has BFEs, but if there's no floodway, the maximum allowable increase in BFE is 1 foot. And if there's a project that is going to have a larger increase, then that requires approval from FEMA in advance for it to be in compliance. And the LOMAR process is the way to get approval from FEMA in advance. And one thing important to note here is that that 1 foot increase is cumulative. So it needs to also consider the potential impacts of any existing or proposed projects that would impact that same area. So the other scenario is when we have an established floodway, and flowways have a no-rise criteria, which means that any project, any encroachment into the flowway must not result in any increase in BFE. That's 0.00 foot typically. And if there is a project that doesn't meet that criteria, it would be not in compliance with the NFIP regulations unless there is a LOMAR approved by FEMA first. All right, so those are the basics. I'm going to move on now to some resources that are available to folks who are working on preparing a LOMAR. I want to mention the Maryland Hydraulics Panel report. This is recommendations that were made by the panel, which is a joint collaboration of Maryland SHA and the MDE. And it's required for SHA projects in FEMA designated special flood hazard areas, and it's also recommended for use by other agencies. The link on the screen here takes you to the website for the hydraulics panel, where you can download the report. One thing about that's in the report that I just wanted to point out is there's a flow chart here. There's actually two. One is for projects in Zone A and one is for projects in Zone AE areas. This is the one specifically for Zone A. The AE one's actually a little more complicated because there's floodways and additional considerations there. Not going to walk through this step by step in the interest of time, but just wanted you guys to be aware that this process exists. It is intended to integrate FEMA's floodplain management requirements with MDE's waterways construction permitting process so that they're aligned and generally, as much as possible, the same engineering analysis can be used for both. There are still some differences, but as much as possible, using the same base models and things like that. The report walks through the process there. It includes engagement with MDE and the communities as part of that process, and it also is helps to make the determination of whether or not a LOMAR is actually required or a LOMAR is required for the projects that you're working on. Also, want to note that FEMA specifically was not directly involved in developing the report and hasn't officially endorsed it, but it was developed with consideration to FEMA's procedures, and if you follow the procedures outlined here, you will be in compliance with FEMA's current MT2 requirements. And just want to also point out the email address on here. This is not in the report, but to engage with MDE, you can email flood.maps@maryland.gov. Also wanted to mention that there is a Maryland hydrology panel and a report that talks about best practices and recommendations for doing hydrologic analysis within Maryland. It's based on GIS Hydro Computer Program that was originally developed back in the 80s and has been updated several times since then. The current, it basically is used to assemble available data to evaluate hydrology for the various watersheds within Maryland. The current iteration of it is GIS Hydro Web, which is a GIS-based web application for performing the hydrology analysis. It was developed by the University of Maryland in conjunction with Maryland State Highway. It has a complete database of DEM, land use, and soils data for the state, and it also includes parts of adjacent states that might be within some of the Maryland watersheds. It has watershed characteristics, and it can provide peak discharge estimates based on regression equations. And TR20 is the numerical model that is built into the tool. TR20 is FEMA accepted. It's the Windows version. And one thing that I'm not sure about is that I don't know if this tool actually produces a TR20 like input file that you can run externally. And just wanted to make sure that people know that if you are submitting to FEMA, you will, for a LOMAR, if you use a tool, you will need to submit like a TR20 executable files as part of the documentation for FEMA. It's not just saying that you ran the tool and got the results. It has to be reproducible outside of this tool. Okay, so now on to resources that FEMA provides. First one that it helps to be familiar with is the MD2 application forms and instructions. There is a checklist at the beginning on the second page of the instructions that has basically an inventory of the major data components that need to be included in an application to FEMA. So this is a good starting point. And then as you go through the instructions, there's different forms depending on your situation. Form 1 is an overview and concurrence form. That's where the community would sign off and the engineer would sign, the engineer of record would sign off and seal that certification statement. There's a second form that's required for almost all LOMARs, which is about the H&H, the hydrology and hydraulic details. And then Form 3 is fairly common as well as for hydraulic structures that are included. And then there are some other forms that are for less common situations, coastal or other unique scenarios. And the rest of the pages of the instructions sort of walk through those forms. And so that's very useful. So that's a specific LOMAR resource. Just in general, how LOMARs fit into the rest of the FEMA world. FEMA has a hierarchy of guidance and standards that LOMARs do fit within. And the top of this pyramid are program standards and working standards. And FEMA has a document that lists all of these standards, and some of them are specifically applicable to MT2s, and we'll call that out, or see here the categories for these are LOMARs. There are others that are more generic, related to things like hydrology and hydraulics or floodplain mapping, that also apply to MT2s, even though they don't fall under the specific LOMAR category. There's guidance documents that FEMA has over 100 guidance documents for different topics, including several for hydrology and hydraulics that are directly applicable to MT2s, because when MT2s are reviewed by FEMA, they look to make sure that the engineering is in compliance with their guidance. And then FEMA also has what they call best practices and lessons learned, which is not something that is necessarily publicly available, but occasionally we've seen them reference this in like calls that we've had with their reviewers, and they've been willing to share those on a case-by-case basis. And there is a guidance document that is specifically for MT2. So this is also very helpful for working on LOMARs. So on the screen here, we've got the link to the general guides and standards website, which has all the information. And then here's also a direct link to the MT2 guidance. So that wraps up our resources. I'm going to jump into the submittal requirements in more detail. Before doing that, it's 12:30, so probably a good time to do a count check just to make sure that people are still with us. So if you're still with us, could you go into the chat and just going to ask people, have you submitted a LOMAR to FEMA or been part of a team that's prepared a LOMAR to submit for FEMA? And you can just say, yes, I have, or no, I haven't, in the chat, and that will just let us know we still have people with us. Okay, so one thing
Real
that
quick, I see someone raise their hand. We're not going to do questions during the presentation. If you have a question, put it in the chat, and I will respond to it. We'll have maybe 5 minutes at the end, so we'll ask Ben at that time.
Yep, I will try to make sure to leave some time at the end. All right, so one thing that is very helpful that isn't 100% required, but it can it can really help the reviewer understand the intent of the LOMAR, and it can really reduce the number of questions that you see from the reviewer and the number of review comments if there's a narrative that explains the approach and the intent of the LOMAR and uses, talks about some of the assumptions that are made in the analysis, anything that's unique about the situation that warrants some additional discussion. It really helps the reviewer get on the same page with what we're trying to accomplish. So like I said, if this isn't included, this is one of the big things that can really delay the processing of a LOMAR. All right, so we have the H&H requirements, the hydrology and hydraulic models need to provide, again, executable versions of the modeling. Needs to be something that the reviewer can run on their end and verify the output. And it's good, again, to document the various coefficients and things that were used in the model, provide the explanation for this source of that data. There's, in HEC-RAS is the most commonly used model. I think in Maryland, the vast majority, probably like 99% of the FEMA effective models are HEC-RAS. HEC-RAS mostly 1D also. So there's a description box in there, and there will oftentimes be notes in there from the effective model being developed, and it's great to add notes to it to briefly explain this was done for this update made on this date for this LOMAR for this project. We also ask people, or we also seek a request to include the vertical datum in this notes box here too. So if it's not already there, or if you're changing it, then make sure to note that. And HEC-RAS is going to be the most common, but there are a lot of other software that is accepted by FEMA. They have a list of accepted models on their website for both hydraulics and hydrology. That's listed here. So if you're going to use a different model than the effective, which first of all, that is not the standard procedure. So if you believe you have a good reason not to use the FEMA effective model, you should probably have some prior coordination with FEMA, maybe with MDE also, because the standard procedures, you start with the effective model and build off of that. I guess in general too, something that is very helpful is to reach out to FEMA in advance of submitting the LOMAR as you're preparing it, and request a pre-submittal call. You can, FEMA has a mapping information exchange. You can call there, and if you have a point of contact with the review team, you can always reach out to them. But if you don't, you can call the FEMA call center and tell them that you're working on a LOMAR in this geographic location, and you'd like to speak to somebody about some pre-submittal questions you have. And that's a good way to, one, you can get any questions you have answered, but also just explain your project and what you're planning to do for the LOMAR to somebody who's on the review team, and it can help reduce the number of review comments that you would see, because any big picture issues with your methodology or approach, if that's something that the reviewer, FEMA is not going to accept, you can get that confirmed before you submit. So I've seen that be very helpful for LOMARs in the past. So just a few modeling requirements that are tied to the CFR. Again, most of the time, the review comments that FEMA provides are tied to requirements that are either in the Code of Federal Regulations or in the other references from FEMA that we mentioned before. One is that the revised base flood elevations must match the effective within half a foot at the limits of revision. So that means that the LOMAR area, the area being updated or revised by the LOMAR, is oftentimes larger than the project site. So, a project might be occurring in a certain area, but it has impacts that stretch further upstream, than the project site or property. So it's very common that a LOMAR will revise area outside of or beyond the property limits of, the project owner. And that's just, that's just the way that it is. And there's notification requirements that go along with that. That's something that's important to understand, is you can't just limit the revision to a particular property or project site. Also, the same floods that are analyzed in the effective must be analyzed in the LOMAR. So typically, the effective models now, I believe they at least include the 10, 50, 100, and 500 year. I think the 25 year and there's like a 1% plus that's also often included in the newer FEMA studies. So look at what is in the effective. If you're not revising the hydrology, oftentimes you can just use the same flows as the effective. If the effective model, if the effective FEMA study is relatively new, if there isn't a good reason to be changing the hydrology, then oftentimes you can just use the FEMA flows. And also something to note is that the preference from the FEMA reviewers typically is to not clip the model to the LOMAR area, to keep the entire length of the model. and just, incorporate the updates into that model. So there's a number of different model scenarios that typically should be included in the application, and depending on the situation. But again, for pretty much all the floodplains in all the FEMA floodplains in Maryland, there's an effective HEC-RAS model, and that would be considered the duplicate effective model. You get that model from FEMA, from the FEMA engineering library, and you could also get it from MDE. But you want to make sure that what you have matches the data that's published in the FEMA flood insurance study. So look at the model you get, both either if you get it from FEMA or from MDE, and compare it to the flood profile in the flood insurance study. If there's a flowway compared to the flowway data table, make sure you're starting with the correct model. And then there's a corrected effective, which would be taking that duplicate effective model and adding any updates to terrain. That this is not, if you have a project, that you're not reflecting your project, but basically you're updating if there's new LiDAR, presumably that predates your project. If you are revising hydrology, and that's not being revised because of your project. If you're adding cross sections to better define the area that your LOMARs in, to better define your project area, add that to the corrected effective model. If there are projects that may have been built in the floodplain that predate the effective study and are not included for some reason, those could be included in the corrected effective model as well. So oftentimes that corrected effective model becomes your base model for incorporating your project. However, if in some instances there may be other projects that have occurred after the date of the effective model, and those should be included in a separate model for your existing or your pre-project conditions model. But again, oftentimes your corrected effective is your existing conditions or your pre-project model. Sometimes the duplicate effective could be as well if you are not updating the terrain, if you're not updating the hydrology, if you're really not doing anything to that effective model other than, basically if that duplicate effective model, if that accurately represents existing conditions at their site, it can be also considered the existing conditions model. And then you have your revised or proposed conditions or as-built conditions. Basically, if it's a LOMAR, it's your proposed conditions model that, the only difference between your existing and proposed is you add your project to the model. And that's what shows the impact of your project. It's the same type of thing that you would do if you were doing a no-rise analysis, basically comparing, pre-project to proposed project conditions. And it's very important or very helpful in your project narrative to sort of walk through any of these models that you have and explain, the process of what was done to update as you step from one model to the next. It's also important in the files that you submit that the files, for example, the HEC-RAS plans are named either with these names, duplicate effective, corrected effective, existing conditions, or if they're named something else for whatever reason that you say what it's representing in this terminology, so the reviewer knows what plan references what model. All right. Hydrology, if hydrology is being revised, all backup data needs to be provided. So anything that was used, like the time of concentration calculations, supporting data for the curve numbers. If there's a gauge that was used to calibrate or validate the model, you can provide the gauge data. drainage area map showing the drainage areas that were used in the model. And then one thing to be aware of is hydrology updates should be done when they are statistically significant. So, especially if the effective is based on regression and you're doing a rainfall runoff model and you get something that's 2% different than what the effective shows, that wouldn't be considered statistically significant. And the FEMA reviewer would probably say, well, we're just not going to change the hydrology because the difference doesn't warrant changing it, considering the uncertainty in hydrology. Also, FEMA has sort of like a hierarchy of level of detail that they look at when looking at different types of hydrology. So regression analysis is sort of like they consider to be the lowest level of detail. So if there is a rainfall runoff model, HAC HMS or TR20 or whatever, that is the basis of the FEMA effective, the hydrology cannot be revised only with regression equations. So typically, in that case, there would need to be an updated rainfall runoff model, and regression equations can be used to calibrate the model or to validate it. But it has to, and of course there's a gauge that needs to be used to calibrate or validate modeling. All right, topographic work map is basically shows the modeling data and the resultant floodplains. Just a kind of a very basic example of a work map is shown here. Got to show the topographic contours, the 1D model cross sections, shows the effective and revised floodplain and floodway boundaries and where they tie into each other. Important to reference the vertical datum was used here, generally for the terrain elevations that are shown. And then, these maps would generally be created using AutoCAD or GIS, and those spatial files would need to be submitted as well, because ultimately that's what FEMA will use to update their maps. Annotated firm is just a copy of the flood insurance rate map with the proposed revision shown on it. This is the best way to show FEMA the expected outcome of the LOMAR. It's essentially just like a less detailed version of what the work map shows without the modeling information and the terrain information. For any projects, any hydraulic structures that are included in the model and aren't exactly as they're modeled from a geometry perspective as the effective model, that will need to be supported by as-built plans for any existing structures and design plans for proposed structures. And the reviewers will often check and make sure that the geometry in the hydraulic modeling matches with the plans that are submitted. As-builts need to be certified. Design plans do not. Briefly touching on levies here. If there is a levy and if the intent is for it to be shown as providing protection on FEMA's maps, basically as having the floodplain stop at the levee and not mapped behind the levee, it needs to meet FEMA criteria for accreditation. There are a lot of criteria here. That's FEMA has a levies guidance document that you can pull up if you're interested. But one thing that's important to note is that what FEMA calls non-levy features. So things that are man-made embankments that might be acting like a levee, but aren't necessarily designed as a levee. So roads, railroads, any other sort of man-made embankments should not be, are not considered as flood protection structures by FEMA. But the floodplain does not stop at those embankments on FEMA's maps. So just something to be aware of if you come across any of these features when you're doing your modeling or mapping, that they the analysis needs to be, at least the mapping needs to be as if that structure is not there, and the landward side of it should be not in the floodplain, unless it is actually shown to meet FEMA's levee accreditation criteria. There are notification requirements. Any increases in the base flood elevation or the special flood hazard area, those impacted property owners need to be notified. Any change at all in the floodway, whether it's an increase or decrease, that also requires notification. This is the revised, final, updated data compared to what's on FEMA's effective maps. There's also a notification requirement for LOMARs for projects that are resulting in an increase in BFE, and that's comparing the proposed conditions to the existing conditions, and that triggers a separate, it's 6512 is the NFIP regulation. There's a notification requirement, and this slide here shows the other requirements, including an evaluation of alternatives that would not cause an increase in BFE, and certification that there are no structures impacted by a BFE increase. Basically, there are no buildings, what FEMA calls insurable structures, in the area where the BFE is increasing. It doesn't matter what the first floor elevation is of that building. It doesn't matter if it's already in the floodplain and the elevation is getting higher, and it's only getting higher by 1/10 of a foot. Any structure, any insurable structure from a flood insurance standpoint that's seeing an increase in the BFE due to the project would be an issue for this regulation. And again, this is applicable for any projects that encroach the flowway and cause any increase, or any projects in a zone AE with no floodway that cause an increase of more than a foot. And that's cumulative with respect to other projects as well. There's also a policy where if you submit a LOMAR in a zone A and the increase is more than a foot, that 6512 requirements are also requested by FEMA. Also for LOMAR only, FEMA requires documentation that the project is in compliance with the Endangered Species Act. The exact documentation that's required is different depending on if the project has a federal action agency, meaning it's funded or permitted by a federal agency. That typically is applicable to highway projects that use federal highway funding, or projects that require an Army Corps permit. FEMA also has an ESA guidance document, and this is explained in more detail in FEMA's MT2 guidance. So I'm not going to go into any more details here. Community concurrence, Matt mentioned this up front. There's a statement on the application and concurrence form that the community would sign off. It's basically saying that the project meets, or is proposed to meet, all of the local floodplain management requirements, and any applicable state or federal local permits have or will be obtained, and also for LOMARs that ESA is in compliance. A lot of times the floodplain administrator doesn't do this just all themselves. They get help from other folks within the community, engineers, other code enforcement officers, things like that. And it's, there's also situations where if there's a concern from a local, you know, always reach out. Again, I mentioned like pre-submittal calls with FEMA, and we can discuss the proposed project or the proposed application with a FEMA reviewer to help answer any questions that we're not sure about, because it's a lot of documentation. It's hard to wrap your mind around all of it, and every project is different. It seems so. There is a review and processing fee for LOMARs. This shows it's typically $8,000 for most LOMARs, and $6,500 for most CLOMARs. If there's a levy, it's a little bit more. If there's no project, if it's just based on updated data, then it is fee exempt. So real quick, common issues that we see using a modeling method not approved by FEMA. Again, if you use the effective model, you should be fine. Missing drainage area maps or other hydrology backup data calculations not included. You know, sometimes we get people that applicants, there's an existing hydrology study that was performed by a third party that we want to leverage, but if we don't have the backup data for it, if we just have a report that has the results, we can't, you know, FEMA is not going to accept that without the backup data. Hydraulics, boundary conditions for the tie-ins especially, make sure that the boundary conditions are appropriate. Structures, the geometry not matching the plans that are submitted. The flowway needs to be modeled appropriately. The surcharge, 1 foot max surcharge, is the requirement for floodways. And then again, BFE tie-ins. And then for the mapping, needs to be consistent with the model results. So if the model, you know, the reviewer oftentimes will compare, okay, these are the flowway top widths that the model's producing, but your map might be showing something slightly different. There's a tolerance, but if it's off by more than a little bit, it'll usually get flagged. The topo needs to be comprehensive enough, not just including the project site, but the entire area that the LOMAR is impacting. The mapping needs to show tie-in, so you know, not just a BFE watershed elevation tie-in, but the horizontal extents of the floodplain and flowway need to tie into the effective at the limits of the revision. Quickly here, what to expect for the timeline. FEMA has 90 days to review and provide review comments after a LOMAR is submitted, and then the applicant has 90 days to respond. And there can oftentimes be multiple rounds of comments. So that's what the arrow going back and forth here shows that can happen more than one time. And then once the data is all accepted by FEMA, then they need to go in and actually prepare the revised data and get it vetted and officially issued. And that can take up to another 90 days. Typically doesn't take that long each time. Most of the time it takes between 6 and 12 months total for it to be issued. And then most LOMARs do have an appeal period after it's issued before it actually becomes effective. That appeal period is 90 days. And typically a LOMAR is effective about 4 to 5 months after it's issued. So all told, the process from when it gets submitted to FEMA to when it actually the change in the map becomes effective from a regulatory perspective is a year to a year and a half. So, you know, why submit a LOMAR? We talked about that up front. In general, it's just for many stakeholders and, you know, floodplain management purposes, it's important to have updated data so we can make informed decisions. Consequences of not submitting, well, we don't have the updated data. We don't know what the correct BFEs are or what the right floodplain, you know, mapping should be. So we're not going to necessarily make the best floodplain management decisions in terms of how high to elevate buildings and whatnot. Also, the insurance requirements might not be based on the most accurate data. Future LOMACs might be delayed. For example, if I submit a LOMA, an MT1 for just a single building, but there was a project just downstream that might impact the BFE and a LOMAR was never submitted, FEMA is going to tell me, no, we can't process this LOMA because we don't know what the correct BFE is. We need to have a LOMAR processed here first. So that could be a big issue if LOMARs aren't submitted when they should be. And then also if during the review process with FEMA or MDE, it's found that a LOMAR, or especially a LOMAR, if a project should have had a CLOMAR but it didn't, that could get flagged as FEMA can flag it as a potential violation, and that could be a compliance issue for the community. So I apologize, that was a full hour. I'm happy to stay on to answer any questions that people have. People are able to stay.
So Ben, thank you very much. I put in the chat for your third requirement for the PDH to type in one thing that you learned today. I think most people got that. I know a lot of people have to leave at 1, so there's no requirement to stay. Dave Gwinnett is our NFIP coordinator, and he looks like he wants to speak and thank Ben, so I'm going to turn it over to him in a second. Lomantha, I'm going to answer your question in the chat.
So yeah, follow up on that. Thank you, Ben. That was great. I love the comments about what people have learned. Probably we need to do this more often. I did see one comment though that I want to kind of call out and just make sure we got this right. So Ben said that you were allowed to put increase the floodplain if it was not a floodway up to a foot. And that may be true for the mapping perspective, but the community you're in has a different sort of prerogative here. You might be in a community that does not allow an increase in floodplain elevations at all. So you have to go back to the community and make sure they're okay with that. So you could go through the LOMAR process. When the community gets to the sign off, they're going to say, no, we don't allow any increases in our floodplain. So just be aware that there's many different hats in this arena, and you got to pay attention to all of them. And thank you for the comment. I appreciate the question.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. This has been incredibly informative. A couple of people asked if we could share the slides. Would you be okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay. We'll put that list together to get those out. And once again, thank you for everyone for joining. We've got 4 more presentations as part of Flood Awareness Month, so you can learn about NFIP requirements. Kim Grove is speaking for CWEA Stormwater Committee regarding flood modeling in Baltimore City. And we've also got one for emergency managers. So I hope you can join our other Flood Awareness Month activities that are coming up.